The fastest way to discover who people really think you are is to let them believe you've already lost. That was the sentence running through my mind the morning my wife looked me straight in the eyes and told me I would always be a failure. She didn't whisper it. She didn't say it during an argument behind closed doors. She said it in a glass conference room overlooking downtown Chicago, with half her executive team pretending not to listen while pretending not to smile. My name is Michael Turner. I'm 42 years old, born in Ohio, raised on the belief that your reputation is built one promise at a time. I don't drive an exotic car. I don't wear $1,000 suits. I still carry the same leather wallet I've owned for 12 years, and I still believe a handshake means something. Somewhere along the way, those things stopped impressing my wife. Ashley Turner had always dreamed bigger than I did, or at least that's what she liked to tell people. She climbed corporate ladders while I quietly built relationships most people never noticed. She loved headlines. I preferred footnotes. She measured success by titles on office doors. I measured it by whether people answered my calls when things fell apart. For years, our differences somehow fit together. Then they slowly became reasons for embarrassment. It didn't happen overnight. It happened through little comments that sounded harmless until they weren't. She laughed when friends asked what I did and answered before I could. Michael consults sometimes, she'd say with a polite smile, leaving out the companies that hired me because discretion was worth more than publicity. She rolled her eyes whenever I arrived in my old silver Ford Explorer instead of leasing something German with a luxury badge. She stopped introducing me as her husband and started introducing me as Michael. It seemed small at first. Then small things began piling up like snow before a blizzard. That Thursday morning, she invited me to stop by her office because, according to her text, the executive team was celebrating a major financing meeting. She said it would be good for me to get out of the house. Those words should have warned me. Instead, I shaved carefully, put on my navy sport coat, and drove across the city through steady commuter traffic, believing maybe we were finally turning a corner. Her company's headquarters occupied the top floors of a steel and glass tower overlooking the Chicago River. Everything inside reflected success. Marble floors, quiet elevators, art that probably cost more than my first house. Employees hurried past carrying laptops and coffee cups like every minute had a price tag attached. Ashley stood near the conference room speaking confidently with her CEO, Grant Wallace. She looked exactly like the woman I'd fallen in love with 15 years earlier, except now her smile belonged to everyone except me. She noticed me, forced a polite smile, and waved me over. "Everyone," she said. "This is my husband, Michael." A few people nodded politely before returning to their conversations. Grant extended a hand. "Good to finally meet you," he said. "Ashley tells us you're between projects." Ashley laughed before I could answer. That's one way to describe it. A couple of executives chuckled into their coffee cups. I smiled anyway. Sometimes silence protects more than explanations ever could. The meeting started minutes later. Charts filled giant screens. Revenue forecasts, market projections, loan applications, expansion plans. Ashley spoke with the confidence of someone who believed the future had already signed its name beneath her presentation. Then one board member asked whether the bank would approve such an aggressive financing package. Ashley shrugged casually before answering. "If they don't, we'll find another way. Unlike some people, failure isn't an option for me." She glanced directly at me. The room stayed quiet for half a heartbeat before she added the sentence I will probably remember for the rest of my life. "Michael's proof that some people are simply born to stay average. He'll always be a failure because he's comfortable being one." Nobody laughed loudly. Corporate people rarely do. Instead, they exchange those restrained smiles professionals where when someone else becomes the joke. Grant looked uncomfortable. One vice president stared at his notebook. Another took a sip of coffee that suddenly seemed fascinating. I felt every eye in that room measuring me against her words. I could have defended myself. I could have listed clients whose names appeared on skyscrapers, hospitals, and charitable foundations. I could have explained why confidential work never appeared on LinkedIn profiles. Instead, I folded my hands together, looked out through the conference room windows toward the river below, and let the silence settle. Because there is one lesson life teaches that pride never does. The truth rarely needs to raise its voice. Sometimes it simply waits for the right phone to ring. Nobody spoke for several seconds after Ashley's words settled over the room. Silence inside a corporate boardroom has its own sound. It is the quiet weight of people calculating what they should say, what they should ignore, and which side they should stand on if the ground suddenly shifts. I kept my eyes on the skyline beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The Chicago River reflected the afternoon sunlight in long silver streaks, and for a strange moment, it reminded me how calm water could hide a powerful current underneath. Grant Wallace cleared his throat and tried to move the meeting forward. "All right, let us focus on the financing package." His voice sounded steady, but I noticed he avoided looking directly at me. Ashley opened another slide filled with colorful charts and projections. She spoke confidently about projected revenue, expansion into 3 additional states, and hiring more than 100 employees over the next 18 months. Everyone around the table nodded with practiced enthusiasm. On paper, everything looked impressive. In reality, I could already see the pressure points hidden beneath the polished presentation. Revenue assumptions depended on contracts that were not finalized. Cash flow projections left almost no margin for unexpected delays. The entire expansion depended on one decision from a single commercial bank. I had seen this pattern before, more times than I could count. Companies rarely collapsed because of one dramatic mistake. They usually collapsed because confident people convinced themselves optimism was the same thing as financial stability. Ashley finished her presentation with a satisfied smile. "Once the bank approves the loan this afternoon, everything else falls into place." A vice president asked, "How confident are they?" Ashley answered immediately, "Very confident. We have done everything they requested." I almost smiled. Almost. Because I knew there was one thing the bank had requested that nobody in this room seemed to understand. It was not another spreadsheet. It was not another projection. It was trust. And trust could not be manufactured overnight. My phone vibrated once inside my jacket pocket. I glanced at the screen without removing it completely. Daniel Brooks. I let it ring once before silencing it. This was not the right moment. Ashley noticed the movement anyway. "Everything all right?" she asked with a hint of annoyance. "Everything is fine," I answered calmly. She gave me the same look she had perfected over the past 2 years, the one that silently translated into, "Please do not embarrass me again." The meeting finally ended. Executives gathered their tablets and coffee cups while discussing dinner reservations and investor calls. A few offered polite smiles as they walked past me. Others acted as though I had already disappeared. Ashley waited until the room had nearly emptied before walking over. "You did not have to stay so long," she said quietly. "I invited you to be supportive, not awkward." I nodded once. I thought I was being supportive. She folded her arms. "Supportive people have ambition, Michael. They build something. They do not settle." I looked at her for a long moment. The woman standing in front of me was brilliant, hardworking, and admired by nearly everyone who knew her professionally. Yet somehow she had become completely blind to the value of quiet strength. "I hope the meeting goes the way you expect," I said. She gave a short laugh. "It will. We finally have serious people handling serious decisions." Those words stayed with me as I walked toward the elevator. Serious people. Funny how often the world mistakes visibility for influence. Down in the lobby, I stepped outside into the cool afternoon air. A breeze carried the smell of roasted coffee from a nearby cafe, mixed with the faint scent of rain drifting across the city. I stood beside my old Ford Explorer for a minute before unlocking the door. My phone rang again. This time I answered. "Michael," Daniel Brooks said without wasting a second, "I have been trying to reach you for the last hour." His voice sounded measured, but underneath it I recognized urgency. "I was occupied," I replied. "I assumed you were at Horizon Dynamics." I glanced back at the tower where Ashley's office overlooked the city. "You assumed correctly." Daniel paused. "Their credit committee meeting ended 20 minutes ago. Ours starts in less than an hour. There is one issue we still cannot resolve." I already knew which issue he meant. "The leadership concerns?" I asked. "Exactly. Financial statements tell us what a company has done. Character tells us what people will do when the pressure starts." I leaned against the driver's door without saying anything. Daniel continued. "The board trusts your judgment more than any consultant we could hire. They know your record. They know the companies you quietly kept alive during the recession. If you believe Horizon deserves this loan, your opinion will carry tremendous weight." I closed my eyes for a brief moment. Above me, the clouds drifted slowly across the Chicago sky, while office workers hurried along the sidewalks without realizing how many lives could change because of one conversation. Daniel spoke again, softer this time. I need your answer before the committee votes. I looked across the street as traffic rolled past in steady waves, each driver carrying problems nobody else could see. Daniel remained silent on the line, patient enough to let me think. That was one of the reasons I respected him. Real decision-makers understood that important answers rarely arrived quickly. Tell me exactly what is bothering the committee, I finally said. Daniel exhaled slowly. The numbers are strong enough to justify discussion, but the board believes the company is growing faster than its leadership can safely manage. There are concerns about executive judgment, internal oversight, and whether the culture can survive financial pressure. None of that surprised me. Banks did not lend millions of dollars because spreadsheets looked attractive. They lent money because they believed the people asking for it would make responsible decisions when everything started going wrong. I had spent nearly 15 years helping lenders separate confidence from competence. Sometimes they listened. Sometimes they learned the expensive way. Has anyone from Horizon addressed those concerns? I asked. They tried, Daniel answered. They spoke about growth, innovation, and market share. Nobody spoke about accountability. I looked back toward the tower where Ashley's office occupied an entire corner floor. From that distance, the glass reflected only clouds. It was impossible to see the people inside. Funny how buildings work that way. They showed you the sky while hiding everything happening beneath the surface. You already know my policy, I said quietly. I never recommend approving a company because I know someone personally. I know, Daniel replied. That is exactly why your opinion matters. I closed my eyes for a moment as old memories drifted back. 15 years earlier, I had worked inside another conference room with another executive team convinced they were unstoppable. They chased expansion without discipline, ignored warnings, and celebrated every new contract while quietly borrowing against tomorrow. When the economy shifted, their entire structure collapsed within 6 months. Hundreds of employees lost their jobs. Families lost homes. Investors lost retirement savings. Ever since then, I had promised myself one thing. I would never allow pride to influence judgment. Not mine. Not anyone else's. I cannot answer until I review one last item. I finally said. Send me the latest governance package. Already in your email, Daniel answered. The committee meets at 4 o'clock. We ended the call. I climbed into my Ford Explorer, but did not start the engine. Instead, I opened my laptop and downloaded the confidential documents Daniel had forwarded. Board minutes, internal policies, risk assessments, audit summaries. Most people would have seen dry paperwork. I saw personality. Every document revealed how leaders thought when nobody outside the company was watching. One page immediately caught my attention. A recommendation from an independent advisor calling for stronger financial controls had been postponed twice without explanation. Another report mentioned executive spending approvals that relied too heavily on a single signature. Small details. Dangerous details. Companies rarely stumbled because of spectacular fraud. They stumbled because successful people slowly convinced themselves ordinary rules no longer applied to them. My phone buzzed again. This time the screen showed Ashley. I answered after the second ring. Are you still downtown? She asked. Her voice sounded calmer than it had inside the conference room. Yes. Grant invited several executives to celebrate tonight. It would probably be better if you skipped dinner. There was an awkward pause before she continued. You looked uncomfortable earlier, and I do not want anyone feeling obligated to entertain you. I smiled to myself, although she could not see it. There had been a time when Ashley worried whether I felt included. Now she worried whether I fit the image she wanted to project. Do not worry about me, I said. I already have work to finish. Good. She replied almost too quickly. This dinner is mostly for people involved in the financing anyway. She wished me a good afternoon and ended the call before I could respond. I sat quietly for another minute with the silent phone resting in my hand. Strange how easily people confuse access with importance. Ashley believed the real decisions would happen over expensive steaks and polished wine glasses. She had no idea the conversation that actually mattered had already taken place beside an aging sport utility vehicle parked on a busy Chicago street. At 3:30, I walked into Brooks Commercial Bank through a side entrance that avoided the public lobby. The receptionist smiled the moment she recognized me. Good afternoon, Mr. Turner. Mr. Brooks is waiting upstairs. Nothing flashy. No special treatment. Just quiet respect built over years of showing up when difficult choices needed honest answers. Daniel greeted me with a firm handshake inside a modest conference room overlooking the financial district. No marble walls, no dramatic artwork, just a long wooden table covered with neatly organized files. He slid one folder toward me without saying a word. On the cover was a single sentence typed in bold letters. Final Credit Committee Recommendation. I rested my hand on the folder, but did not open it immediately. Daniel watched me carefully before asking the one question that mattered more than every balance sheet, forecast, and presentation combined. Michael, when this company faces its first real crisis after receiving $12 million, do you believe the people leading it will choose their pride, or will they choose what is right? I did not answer Daniel immediately. Instead, I opened the folder and slowly turned each page, letting the facts speak before my emotions had the chance to interrupt. That habit had saved more companies than any financial model ever could. Balance sheets could be adjusted. Forecasts could be rewritten. Character left fingerprints everywhere if you knew where to look. The committee's notes confirmed everything I had already suspected. Horizon Dynamics had talent. It had opportunity. It even had a promising market. What worried everyone was not the business. It was the leadership culture slowly forming beneath the polished presentations. Decisions were becoming centralized. Dissenting opinions were quietly dismissed. Risk controls were treated like obstacles instead of protection. I had watched that pattern destroy companies before. Daniel folded his hands on the table. He knew better than to rush me. Outside the conference room, people moved through the bank carrying folders, laptops, and coffee cups. Every face looked calm, yet every office in the building contained someone deciding the future of another family, another business, another dream. Money was never just money. It was trust measured in numbers. I finally looked up. The company deserves a chance, I said carefully. Daniel remained silent. He knew there was more coming. But they do not deserve an unconditional approval. His expression softened slightly. Explain. I slid one of the governance reports across the table. Their expansion plan is realistic only if they improve internal oversight. Right now, too much authority depends on too few people. If revenue drops even 10%, pride will tempt them to hide problems instead of solving them. Daniel nodded slowly. The committee reached a similar conclusion. Then attach conditions, I continued. Quarterly compliance reviews. Independent financial reporting. Executive accountability. Give them capital, but also give them structure. Daniel leaned back in his chair. And if they reject those conditions? I answered without hesitation. Then they are proving they were never ready for the loan in the first place. A quiet smile crossed his face. That sounds exactly like the Michael Turner I have known for 14 years. I returned the smile, although it carried little satisfaction. My recommendation would probably save Ashley's company, but it would also place boundaries around leadership that she might not appreciate. Ironically, the greatest favor I could do for her organization would feel like an insult to her pride. Daniel closed the folder. One more question. Go ahead. Can you separate your marriage from this decision? I looked through the conference room window toward the skyline. The answer came easier than I expected. I already have. He studied my face for a long moment before standing and extending his hand. Thank you. I will present your recommendation exactly as you gave it. We shook hands once. Firm. Quiet. Professional. No celebration. Important decisions rarely deserved applause. As I left the conference room, my phone vibrated again. This time it was a message from Ashley. Dinner starts at 6:30. Do not wait up. I stared at the screen for several seconds before placing the phone back into my pocket. Years earlier, she would have asked if I wanted to join her. Now she simply informed me where she would be. Small changes always arrived first. Big endings usually followed later. I drove home through slow evening traffic while a light rain began falling over Chicago. The windshield wipers moved back and forth with the same steady rhythm that had accompanied thousands of ordinary drives during our marriage. I thought about the first apartment Ashley and I rented after our wedding. The furniture came from garage sales. The kitchen table wobbled every time we ate dinner. We celebrated paying bills on time because that felt like success back then. She used to tell me that no matter how wealthy we became, she never wanted us to become people who looked down on others. Somewhere between promotions, bonuses, and corporate recognition, those words quietly disappeared. By the time I pulled into our driveway, dusk had settled across the neighborhood. The porch light came on automatically as I stepped out of the Ford. The house felt unusually quiet. I loosened my tie, poured myself a cup of coffee instead of something stronger, and sat alone at the kitchen table. The silence was almost comforting. Then my laptop chimed. A secure message from Daniel Brooks had arrived. The subject line contained only 4 words. Credit Committee Decision. I opened the document slowly. The first sentence made me stop breathing for just a moment. Horizon Dynamics had been approved for the full $12 million commercial loan, exactly as recommended. But beneath the approval appeared 4 mandatory conditions, including independent financial oversight, quarterly governance reviews, and one final requirement that none of Horizon's executives had requested or expected. The bank required an external strategic advisor, approved by the committee, to monitor implementation during the first year. I read the final line twice before closing the laptop. The committee had unanimously selected me. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm. That had always been my routine, even during the years when nobody noticed how much work happened before the day officially began. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic moving through the neighborhood. For a few minutes, I simply sat at the edge of the bed and looked around the room. It was strange how a place could remain exactly the same while everything inside it felt different. The approval from the bank was not a victory I wanted to celebrate. It was a responsibility I had accepted because too many people depended on the decision. Employees, families, investors who trusted the company, people who had nothing to do with the tension between Ashley and me. That was something I had learned a long time ago. Personal feelings could never be allowed to damage professional judgment. I made coffee, opened my laptop, and reviewed the documents Daniel had sent the night before. The official announcement had not gone out yet. Horizon Dynamics executives still believed they were waiting for a simple approval. They did not know the conditions attached. They did not know the person assigned to monitor the process. And they definitely did not know that the person they had dismissed in a conference room was now the person responsible for making sure their future remained stable. At 8:15, I received a message from Ashley. She did not mention the meeting. She did not ask about my evening. Instead, she wrote, "We are celebrating the loan approval tonight. Please try to be supportive." I read the message twice. Not because the words were complicated, but because of what was missing. There was no curiosity, no question about whether I was doing well, no recognition that I had spent hours reviewing the same company she had dedicated her life to building. Just an expectation that I would appear and play my role. I placed the phone on the kitchen counter and continued working. A few hours later, I arrived at Horizon Dynamics for the first official meeting after the approval. The atmosphere was completely different from the day before. Employees moved through the hallways with excitement. People smiled. Teams discussed upcoming projects. Success has a certain energy, and everyone wanted to be close to it. Ashley greeted me outside the executive conference room. She wore a confident expression, the same one she used during presentations. "Glad you came," she said. "This is a big moment for everyone." I nodded. "It is." She seemed satisfied by the answer and walked ahead without noticing the irony. Inside the room, Grant Wallace stood beside a large screen displaying the company logo. Several executives gathered around the table. They congratulated Ashley and discussed expansion plans. Nobody knew that the Real conversation was about to change everything. Daniel Brooks joined through a video call at exactly 9:30. The room became quiet as everyone listened. "Congratulations to Horizon Dynamics," Daniel began. "The credit committee has approved the $12 million commercial loan." Applause filled the room immediately. Ashley smiled proudly. Grant looked relieved. For a moment, everything appeared exactly as they expected. Then Daniel continued. "However, approval comes with several requirements designed to protect the company, its employees, and its investors." The room became still. He explained the financial reviews, the governance improvements, and the independent oversight requirement. Some executives exchanged uncertain looks. Ashley's expression changed slightly. Not fear, not anger, confusion. She was trying to understand why a routine approval sounded more complicated than expected. Then Daniel said the final sentence. "The committee has selected Michael Turner as the external strategic advisor overseeing implementation during the first year." Nobody spoke. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It was not the silence of people judging me. It was the silence of people discovering they had misunderstood me. Ashley looked at me as if she was seeing a stranger sitting across the table. Grant slowly leaned forward. "Michael," he asked, You were involved in this process? I looked around the room before answering. I reviewed the information required by the bank. My role is simply to make sure the company follows the plan it presented. It was a simple answer. I did not need to explain every detail of my career. I did not need to list every organization I had advised or every difficult decision I had helped navigate. The truth did not become more valuable because I announced it louder. Ashley remained silent for several seconds. Then she asked quietly, "Why did you never tell me?" I looked at her and thought about all the years we had spent together, all the conversations, all the moments when she had chosen assumptions over questions. "I never hid who I was," I said. "You just decided you already knew." The room remained quiet after my answer. Not the uncomfortable silence from the day before. This was different. It was the kind of silence that appeared when people were forced to reconsider a story they had already accepted as fact. Ashley looked at the documents in front of her, then back at me. For the first time in years, I saw uncertainty on her face. Not because she was afraid of me, but because she was realizing she had never truly understood me. Grant Wallace adjusted his chair and cleared his throat. "Michael, I had no idea you were connected to the bank's review process." I looked at him calmly. I was not connected to the bank's decision. I provided an independent recommendation. He nodded slowly, but his expression showed he was trying to connect pieces that had never made sense before. The man they had ignored during meetings was suddenly the person everyone needed to listen to. That was the strange thing about reputation. Sometimes people only respected what they could measure. A title, a position, a corner office. They rarely noticed patience, experience, and years of quietly solving problems behind the scenes. The meeting continued, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Executives who had barely acknowledged me before were suddenly asking thoughtful questions. They wanted to know how I evaluated risk. They wanted to understand why the bank required additional oversight. They wanted explanations for decisions they had once considered unnecessary. I answered every question the same way I always had. With facts. No anger. No desire to prove a point. The goal was never to embarrass anyone in that room. The goal was to protect the company and the people depending on it. After the meeting ended, most of the executives left quickly. Ashley remained seated. She looked at the empty conference room table, then at the city outside the windows. "You really have been doing this all these years?" she asked. I sat across from her. "Doing what?" "Helping companies. Advising people. Making decisions like this." I thought about the question. "Yes." She looked down. "Why did you never tell me?" There it was again. The question that sounded simple, but carried years of assumptions behind it. I leaned back slightly. "I told you what mattered. I told you I worked with businesses. I told you I had clients. I told you I spent time reviewing financial problems. But you never said you had this kind of influence." I nodded. "Because influence was never the point." She looked confused. "Then what was?" I glanced around the room where everyone had spent the morning discussing growth, numbers, and success. Being useful. That was always the point. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I remembered when Ashley and I were younger. Before the company. Before the titles. Before success became something we measured against other people. Back then, she did not care about what appeared on my business card. She cared about who I was when nobody else was watching. Somewhere along the way, that changed. "Michael," she finally said, "I think I made a mistake." I listened, but I did not rush to comfort her. Not because I wanted her to feel bad. Because some realizations needed space. "A mistake about what?" I asked. She looked toward the window. "About you." Outside, Chicago continued moving. Cars crossed intersections. People walked between buildings carrying coffee and conversations. The world kept going, even when someone's understanding of it changed completely. "Ashley," I said quietly, "the hardest part is not that you underestimated me. People do that all the time. The hardest part is that you stopped being curious about me." Her eyes became softer, and for a second I saw the woman I married years ago. The woman who used to ask about my ideas and listen to my answers. "I thought you had given up," she said. I shook my head. "No, I just stopped needing everyone to notice." She looked at the folder containing the bank approval. The same folder that had changed the way everyone viewed me. But I knew something she did not. That document had not created my value. It had only revealed something that had existed all along. My phone buzzed before either of us could say anything else. It was Daniel Brooks. Another issue had appeared. During the final review process. A concern hidden inside Horizon Dynamics' internal records. I stood up slowly, and answered the call. Because while everyone else was focused on discovering who I was already focused on what needed to be done next. Daniel's voice on the phone was quieter than usual, and that immediately told me the situation was serious. People who worked with numbers every day understood the difference between a small concern and a problem waiting for attention. "Michael, I need you to come back to the office," he said. "There is something in the internal review that changes the way we need to approach this." I looked across the conference room where Ashley was still sitting. She had heard only my side of the conversation, but she could tell from my expression that this was not a simple follow-up call. "What happened?" she asked. I ended the call and placed my phone on the table. "The bank found something that needs to be reviewed before the next phase begins." Ashley immediately became defensive. "Is this about the loan conditions? I thought everything was approved." "The loan was approved," I replied. "That does not mean every concern disappears." That sentence seemed to surprise her. For years, Ashley had viewed success as a finish line. I had always viewed it as a responsibility that continued after the celebration ended. We drove separately back to the bank because I needed time to review the information Daniel had prepared. During the drive, I thought about how quickly situations changed when people finally looked beneath the surface. A company could appear successful from the outside while carrying problems nobody wanted to discuss. At Brooks Commercial Bank, Daniel met me in the same conference room as before. This time, there were additional files on the table. "We discovered inconsistencies between several internal reports," he explained. "Nothing that proves wrongdoing, but enough to require a deeper review." I opened the documents carefully. The issue was not one dramatic mistake. It was a pattern: delayed reporting, unanswered questions from financial officers, decisions made without enough documentation. Each individual item seemed small. Together, they created a picture that required attention. "Who approved these decisions?" I asked. Daniel pointed to the signatures. Most came from senior leadership. Some came directly from Grant Wallace. Others carried Ashley's approval. I felt a familiar disappointment. Not because they had made mistakes. Everyone made mistakes. The problem was that nobody had created an environment where people felt comfortable admitting them early. Strong organizations were not built by pretending problems did not exist. They were built by facing them before they became impossible to ignore. "What happens now?" Daniel asked. I closed the folder. "Now we do exactly what we promised. We protect the company, not individual pride." Later that afternoon, I returned to Horizon Dynamics. The energy inside the office had changed from celebration to uncertainty. Employees noticed when executives became quiet. They noticed when meetings that were supposed to be simple became longer. Ashley met me near her office. "I heard there are additional reviews," she said. Her voice was controlled, but I could hear the concern underneath. "There are. Does this affect the loan?" I looked at her. "It affects how the company moves forward." "That is different." She lowered her voice. "Michael, people are already talking." I understood what she meant. She was not worried only about the business. She was worried about reputation, about how others would see her. "Ashley, the people who work here are not worried about appearances. They are worried about stability. Their families depend on this company." She looked away for a moment. That was the first time I saw her consider the situation from someone else's perspective. Not as a public image problem. Not as an executive challenge. As a human responsibility. The next morning, we held a leadership meeting. Grant arrived looking confident, but that confidence faded when Daniel presented the review findings. Nobody accused anyone of anything. Nobody raised their voice. The conversation remained professional. That was important. Real accountability did not need drama. It needed honesty. When the meeting ended, Grant stayed behind. "I underestimated you," he admitted. I looked at him. "You underestimated a lot of people." He nodded slowly. "That is probably true." As I left the building that evening, I passed employees preparing reports and finishing projects. They did not know every detail of what had happened. They did not need to. What mattered was that the company had a chance to correct its path. And for the first time in a long time, Ashley walked beside me without looking ahead to see who was watching. She simply walked beside me. It was a small moment, but small moments often reveal the biggest changes. The days after the leadership meeting felt different inside Horizon Dynamics. Not because everything had suddenly become perfect. Companies did not transform overnight. Trust did not return because of one conversation. But something important had changed. People had started asking better questions. Managers were reviewing decisions more carefully. Employees who had remained quiet for months were finally sharing concerns they had been afraid to mention. That was the difference between an organization that wanted to look successful and one that wanted to actually become successful. I spent the next several weeks working with the leadership team. My role was not to control the company. It was to help create a system where good decisions could survive even when the pressure increased. Some executives welcomed the changes immediately. Others struggled because they were used to moving quickly without being challenged. Growth was exciting, but responsibility was what kept growth alive. Ashley watched everything more closely than before. At first, I think she expected me to use my position to prove a point. She expected criticism. Maybe she even expected me to remind everyone in the building what had happened in that conference room. But I never did. That was not who I wanted to become. There is a difference between being respected and demanding respect. One comes from character. The other disappears the moment people stop paying attention. One evening, almost a month after the bank approval, Ashley and I sat across from each other at the small kitchen table in our house. It was the same table where we had eaten cheap takeout years earlier when we were just starting our lives together. The surface had scratches now. The chairs were not stylish. Nothing about it belonged in a magazine. But it held more memories than anything expensive we had ever purchased. "I owe you an apology," Ashley said quietly. I looked up from my coffee. "For what?" She took a breath before answering. "For believing I understood your value when I never really took the time to understand you." I stayed quiet. Not because I wanted her to struggle with the words, but because some conversations needed room to be honest. "I thought success looked a certain way," she continued. "The title, the office, the recognition. I thought if people could not see it, it did not exist." She looked down at her hands. "And then I realized I was doing the same thing to you that I always said I hated when people did to others." I knew that was not an easy thing for her to admit. Ashley had built her career by being confident. Admitting she had been wrong required a different kind of strength. "What matters now is not what happened before," I said. "What matters is what we do next." She nodded slowly. "Do you think we can fix things?" The question stayed between us. I thought about the years behind us. The moments when we supported each other. The moments when we stopped listening. Relationships were not businesses. There were no spreadsheets that could calculate every mistake or formula that guaranteed success. "I think people can change," I said. "But change has to be proven through actions, not promises." She accepted that answer without arguing. That was new. The following week, Horizon Dynamics officially announced the completion of its restructuring plan. The bank released a statement confirming the company had met the required improvements. Employees celebrated because their jobs felt more secure. Investors felt more confident. The company had another opportunity to grow the right way. During the announcement event, Grant Wallace asked me to stand beside the leadership team. I almost refused. Not because I wanted to avoid attention, but because I knew the story was never really about one person being right and another person being wrong. It was about what happens when people make assumptions without knowing the full picture. When I stepped onto the stage, I looked across the room and saw employees who had worked hard despite uncertainty. They were the reason the company mattered. Not the building, not the reputation, not the numbers, the people. After the event, Ashley joined me outside near the entrance. The Chicago skyline stretched above us, glowing with evening lights. "You know what surprises me most?" she said. "What?" "You never wanted everyone to know who you were." I smiled slightly. "Because knowing my name was never the important part." She looked at me. "Then what was?" I watched people leaving the building, heading home to their families and ordinary lives. Being the kind of person who does the right thing when nobody is watching. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The city continued moving around us. The same city where I had once walked away feeling invisible. The same city where I had learned that being underestimated was not the same as being defeated. Sometimes people only see what is obvious. Sometimes they miss the value standing right in front of them. But eventually, the truth has a way of becoming impossible to ignore.